All right, now I'd like to welcome to the show Vinnie Vernuccio, president and co-founder of the Institute for the American Worker. Welcome to Free the Economy, Vinnie.
Hey, Richard, it's good to be on. Thanks. And, it's always good to be back doing stuff with CEI.
Oh yeah, thank you. Uh, so so we're talking all about labor and workforce policy here today, and I feel like we can sort of like take a brief look back before we look at what's coming next. We just recently pivoted from 4 years of Biden administration labor policy, which seemed geared to me to sort of benefiting union leadership in every kind of possible way, often riding sort of pro labor union goals into what to me seemed were sometimes seemingly unrelated policy initiatives. What grade would you give that the Biden era workforce policy we've seen?
Well, it depends on what scale you're looking at. It depends what point of view you're looking at. But overall, not very good grades. Even Biden, who said he was going to be the most pro-union president in history, saw union membership across the country fall and continue to be in the doldrums. So even with bringing the full weight of the federal government, the regulations, the case decisions out of the National Labor Relations Board, regulations out of the Department of Labor, memorandums of understanding with seemingly completely unrelated agencies like the FTC, they still saw union membership fall. So even for their stated goal with their core constituency, the policies that they were pushing forward simply did not work, even from a standpoint of doing, anything they could to boost unions.
So the Biden team may be more or less out the door, but we've still got a lot of debate in Congress, talking about some of the same policies that the Biden team supported, or sort of directionally similar ones, and you know that is now a bipartisan, at least slightly bipartisan thing. So earlier this year we had Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri. He teamed up with Cory Booker, Democrat of New Jersey, to co-sponsor a bill called the Faster Labor Contracts Act, and the sort of pro labor union people in Congress have made noises about kind of other similar related policies. What do you think about that specific bill, faster labor contracts, and then some of the other proposals we've seen in Congress in the last past year or so?
Yeah, absolutely. And he also got the newly christened Senator Moreno from Ohio on that bill as well. And thankfully, Moreno has been out there and saying that, he's not supporting Hawley's larger framework. And before we get into the Faster Labor Contracts Act, Senator Hawley has proposed this framework without really any more details of, several different provisions. Most of them look like they're, at least conceptually, it's a copy and paste of the union wish list legislation, one of the top Democrat priorities, the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, and happy to get into some of those more specific provisions. But it's, a combination between that and this thing called the Warehouse Bill as well. But going back to your question on the Faster Labor Contracts Act, yeah, this essentially would allow, unelected bureaucrats to force two parties into arbitration. So essentially, this is, having this, third party of arbitrators essentially write a first contract if they can't get to an agreement in a sufficient time. And, that sufficient time, that's only a couple months. So it really is unrealistic to have a company get organized, a private sector company get organized, and then, literally within a matter of weeks, have the union come up with their bargaining committee and then write, what is effectively mandating a contract on every single portion of that workforce. And the time frame that Hawley puts in there is unrealistic. He's trying to expand out a government agency that President Trump is actually trying to contract. And of course, right after it came out, the Teamsters came out in force of saying how much they supported it and how much they support Hawley's framework in general. But happy to get into more specifics if you'd like.
Well, actually, maybe it makes sense to even step back a step and say what's the bigger picture here. I know when you started the Institute for the American Worker. This is about you know workforce policy, labor unions, and all those sort of like laws and regulations that go along with it. But I feel like we a lot of people don't understand the difference between being pro like labor union and labor boss and being pro worker, right? Because the whole reason why we have labor unions in the first place, ostensibly, is that we want good jobs, we want lots of jobs, we want lots of good paying jobs, and for a lot of people, labor unions were a path to get to that thing, but it's also possible for them to be an impediment to those good things, like plentiful, abundant employment. So, talk to me how you think about how to help and support American workers while saying helping and supporting union bosses isn't always the same thing.
That's right. And the easiest juxtaposition there is looking at the Protecting the Right to Organize Act that was just reintroduced this Congress, that, Hawley borrows a bunch of provisions from, and comparing that to the Employee Rights Act from last year that, will, hopefully be reintroduced in this Congress. And that looks at, just look at independent contracting. The PRO Act would try to impose the disastrous experiment, the failed experiment that California did in restricting people's ability to work for themselves, while the Employee Rights Act would allow them more ability to work for themselves. And, there's several other bills in Congress, specifically bills that Representative Kiley has recently introduced that would allow workers to more work for themselves. The PRO Act would stop small businesses from having the opportunity to essentially be a franchise. While the Employee Rights Act would say that, would encourage a traditional definition of what is a franchise, who is an employer of those franchise employees. Things like in the ERA that has secret ballot protections. So yeah, if workers want to join a union, they should have that ability, especially in the private sector, but just make sure they're not intimidated. And things like the secret ballot protections in the ERA would do that. Meanwhile, the PRO Act would essentially pull the rug from under workers that had a secret ballot election and saying, well, the employer might have done something wrong, so we're going to go ahead and allow that union to represent you anyway. And the list can go on and on. I won't get into too many of the nitty-gritty details, but when you look at it and what the PRO Act fails, and essentially a lot of those provisions in the PRO Act, the Biden administration tried to do by regulation. And on the flip side, what the ERA is trying to do that is pro worker, it really focuses on that individual worker freedom, their choice, their ability to make an informed decision. And that really is the difference. And frankly, I think that if unions embrace those concepts in the ERA, they embrace worker freedom, they embrace individual choice, they give up the government granted training wheels of compulsion, I actually think they can thrive, except what's happening, and what you saw in the last 4 years of the Biden administration, is that they're simply doubling down on the failed bargaining model of the past. That's why they keep losing members, because workers just don't want what they're selling.
Well, yeah, and so you kind of hinted at the difference between sort of the traditional private sector and then the public sector government employee unions. When we talk about labor unions in general in the U.S., sometimes we fail to like make that distinction, and we sort of imagine the sort of construction and manufacturing workers in hard hats. That's a sort of like the traditional mental picture of union workers. But of course, there's a huge percentage of current labor union members are federal, state, and local government employees. And so I think you can correct me on these exact numbers if I'm going wide, but I think private sector unions have been in decline for, I don't know, 50 years, where they used to be about a third of the workforce, and now they're like under 10% of the workforce. While the government employees unions seem to be almost flipped, where it's now they're about a third of all government workers. These two big picture trends, one where private sector workers' unionization has fallen dramatically and it's increased in cases of government employees. What should that tell us? What should we learn from those numbers and those trends?
Well, once again, especially in the private sector, this one size fits all adversarial relationship, us versus them mentality, that is at the heart of union collective bargaining. Workers just don't want that. You see modern workers, you see the rise of the gig economy, you see the rise of independent contracting, people that want to work for themselves, that frankly want to be rewarded for how hard they work or how productive they are. And that just doesn't fit into the current union collective bargaining model, whether it's private sector or public sector. It's, really that one size fits all adversarial model that I think is the main problem with collective bargaining. So, you see union membership as raw numbers slightly going up, but as far as the number of workers in the percentage in the full economy, especially in the private sector, you're right, those numbers are falling and, they fell below 10%, for the first time, I think, in record, since, really unions were able to have the current bargaining scheme they have today. Shifting over to the private sector, it went up very precipitously, essentially the 60s, 70s, 80s. Um, Recently, those numbers have kind of plateaued or have gone down a little bit. And, you are seeing some states say, well, you know, perhaps the bargaining arrangements in the private sector don't translate over as well to the public sector. And sorry, I said recently I misspoke. The kind of hallmark quote on this is actually FDR that was against public sector bargaining. So you are now seeing states like Utah and other states actually push back and say, well, maybe we need to ratchet these things back. So it really is an interesting time.
Well, yeah, I'm sort of interested in the kind of like conceptual argument for why, say like all the way back to FDR or the Republicans from that era, people like Calvin Coolidge, why they wouldn't have approved of uh, government employee unions in the first place. That the sort of one argument is that government employment is fundamentally different from private sector employment, and then so with the private sector, you need the bosses and the workers kind of butting heads, and they negotiate over pay and benefits and that sort of thing. But when you're talking to government workers, it's a matter of government policy. So we elect people, we elect city councils, we elect state legislators, and they are the people who are setting the policy, and that it's not that they need to hire workers who will implement the policies of the government, and it's not the same thing as a private sector negotiation between private employees and someone who just makes widgets, right? Like we've already sort of negotiated on their behalf by voting for the people who want to like put the policies in that the government employees then are have to follow. That's why they're hired in the first place. And so I wonder if is the skepticism and like, as you just mentioned in some states about ever increasing government employees and unions, is that just a practical matter, or is it this sort of like public spirited theory that government employees are fundamentally different because they're exercising the will of the people theoretically?
Well, speaking of the will of the people and fundamentally different, the Supreme Court has ruled and essentially saying that everything that these government unions do is political. And going back to your point on public policy, it's yeah. I mean, when you think about it, let's say they're negotiating for higher pay. Where does that money come from? That comes from tax dollars. If they're negotiating for the length of the school day, how long teachers are going to be in the classroom. You're right. That's public policy. And the Supreme Court has ruled that because the inherently political or policy nature of what public sector unions are negotiating over, public employees should not be forced to subsidize that speech. And this was, of course, the case in Janus versus AFSCME that brought right to work protections to public employees across the country. And, Rich, I know we haven't talked about right to work yet, but essentially right to work means that a union can't get a worker fired for not paying them. In the private sector, a majority of states have it. But thankfully now, because of these issues that you just brought up and the Janus versus AFSCME case, public employees from across the country now have that right to choose.
Well, yeah, and so when we talk about all sorts of policy areas, but including things like labor and employment, what happens at the federal level often gets the most attention. But uh, we have we have federalism, we have a federal system, and so individual states have a lot of influence in policy here, and so that the sort of like right to work policies um, are at the state level. And so we've had as you said, it's a majority of states now, but there's been a big process of more states adopting right to work policies, and those states, uh, the economic growth in those states being associated with more opportunities for workers. And so a lot of the states that have adopted them, say like states in the southeast United States, where there's increased growth, where there's increased inbound migration, and things like that. Not all of that is due to a state adopting a policy like right to work, but it's been associated with a lot of people we know, a lot of economic policy people, a lot of analysts who have said this is part of where the most successful states are going. The most successful states growth wise, the most successful states jobs wise, the most successful states inbound migration wise. Uh, you have, the key is things like, low taxes, reasonable regulation, including regulation of labor and employment. So that's sort of my lead into it. But where is the movement we've seen in right to work? If we think right to work protections are a good thing, we've been moving more in that direction, right, in recent years.
Yeah, I definitely. I mean, yes, right to work is a good thing. Taking away a union's ability to get workers fired for not paying them, that is absolutely a good thing. But you also see that states that adopt right to work, they have higher wage growth. They have workers have more disposable income. They're making more when you factor in cost of living. They have higher manufacturing growth. So, right to work states are, especially by comparison, doing a lot better than the non-right to work states. They have higher population growth, for example. In fact, there's even been studies that have, compare cross counties. One state is a right to work state, then just across the border is a non-right to work state. And you see the counties in the right to work state, they are doing a lot better in several areas than the non-right to work states. But just going back, and I do want to clarify for the audience out there the difference between private sector and public sector. So most private sector labor law is governed at the federal level. That's Congress, that's DOL, that's National Labor Relations Board. So you're talking most private sector is federal. Public sector, on the other hand, with the exception of public employees, with federal employees, is mostly state and local. So when we are talking about public sector labor law, that is for the most part left up to the states. Right to work is the exemption, but right to work is the exemption because the federal government left that ability for the states to choose. But with all that being said, there actually is some really interesting innovations of states that are protecting private sector employees. And I'm thinking states like Tennessee and Alabama and Georgia that recently took steps to protect private sector employees' ability to vote by secret ballot. And essentially, what they said is that in order to get state economic development incentives, you have to guarantee that you're going to protect your employees' rights. So, it is interesting there, and I know other states are looking at that as well. But I did want to talk about kind of the different levels of, which government, whether it's federal or state, are applying to which employees, whether it's private sector or public sector.
Mhm. Yeah, and when we think about comparing, like you said, across states and even across border counties, sometimes uh, where we see more sort of growth and more opportunity. I know we've had sort of having a big moment right now to talk about abundance, the idea of abundance. In the book of that title just came out by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson. That's getting a lot of attention, and so that's about the idea of abundance, or what people call the abundance agendas. The idea that government policy should be trying to bring down the costs of things, big things like housing, transportation, healthcare, higher education, and to make them more abundant and available to Americans at all income levels. And then we've had a bunch of policies in the past and currently that have increased the prices of those things in sort of unfortunate and ultimately unnecessary ways. And one of the proposals I've seen to remediate some of these problems is to reform labor union clauses that are in federal programs or in contracting, and that require things like union pay scales rather than just the most affordable labor you can find. Um, how do you think that fits in with labor and workforce policy? Again, sort of government policy having to driving up costs, whether it's things like the CHIPS Act or infrastructure spending or any of these big federal programs.
Yeah, I mean, if you talk about some of the federal programs, you saw some of the some of the EV provisions and some of the former, larger federal funding bills that said, well, these grants and incentives are only going to factories with a collective bargaining agreement or something like that. So I think that kind of cuts against the idea, whether you agree with it or not, of trying to incentivize things like electric vehicles or things like that. It's, pick one. Do you want to help a special interest or do you want, the stated reason for the program? And once again, I'm not saying that, these incentives are a good or a bad thing, not weighing in there. I'm just, going into, it is kind of counterintuitive of what they're trying to do here. But if you're talking about things like Davis-Bacon or project labor agreements that, mandate union-esque wage scales or you must agree to a union's demands in order to get this federal grant. There are a lot of other ways that people are talking about, how do you calculate that? So for instance, right now, this thing called Davis-Bacon, which, essentially says that you have to pay prevailing wage within a certain area. There's all sorts of issues with, the Davis-Bacon, how that number is calculated, whether it's, the multiple types of job classifications. If you're a carpenter in the basement, is that a different pay scale than a carpenter on the first floor or the second floor of the building? And if it is, you have to have somebody monitoring people like punching in and out on the stairs going from floor to floor. Or that it's survey, which could be really unreliable. Maybe only the unions are filling out the survey. So, is there a way to streamline all of that even within the law and say, okay, well, maybe we recalculate how those numbers are computed? The Bureau of Labor Statistics, for instance, has a lot of that table. Maybe we just, focus on that. Or do you condense a lot of those work classifications so you don't have to have, somebody on the stairs watching people clock in and clock out as they, go from one floor to the other. So, there's a lot of creative ideas out there. And there are a lot of issues with kind of, tagging on these provisions, some of those old funding bills that say, yeah, you have to use, a unionized workforce, or these grants can only go for products, that are produced in a factory with collective bargaining.
Yeah, and the idea that a lot of this is based on these like complicated, lists of data, that it's sort of complicated enough that it's not easy to see when it's smart and when it's not, right? It's sort of the sort of like blizzard of statistics and the idea that you would, in order to administer these programs, you need someone, standing, like you said, standing on the stairs to see when someone moves from one tiny sub job to another, subcategory of jobs. Go seems to kind of go against what we have, certainly at the moment, the sort of ethos from DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, that we need a government that's leaner, that's faster, that's smarter, that's more efficient, that's taking advantage of things like artificial intelligence applications. Um, it seems like a lot of this federal labor stuff is still in like the 1930s, like the New Deal era, responding to the Great Depression, when we could have something that is like I said, faster, quicker, more efficient, all that stuff. But this question of efficiency and how do we do this the fastest, smartest, best way, puts me in mind of something that was probably the number one labor story just a few months ago in America, which was port workers and the longshoremen strike. So the longshoremen's workers at big ports in America, they were threatening to go on strike and sort of cripple all the imports and exports in America. If their demands weren't met, ultimately they basically were met. And they got wage increases, which you would expect in a new negotiating for a contract, but they also got assurances that major port operators wouldn't automate port operations. And despite the fact that the sort of technologies they don't like is already just sort of standard in a lot of other big modern ports in the world, I wonder what do you think is the long term what's the long term play there? Surely we can't refuse to automate American ports indefinitely. Um, I mean, if they really wanted to be aggressive, they could say, well, we're not using trucks anymore. We're using horse carts, and that would produce more jobs because everything would have to move slower. And, they'd need more, uh, horse veterinarians. Um, is there, so I've sort of suggested there is, but what do you think? Is there a conflict between the policy making feeling at the national level, the Trump administration wanting to be big in government efficiency, and the sort of traditional demands of a union like the longshoremen? Is that a problem that we need to resolve, or is it sort of a sui generis thing? It's just the longshoremen are going to be longshoremen. What are you going to do?
And I believe that, in the contract there was, was some room. They opened the door for automation, but they're still having things. Well, you have to, have the same amount of people on the job and things like that. So, there are a lot of people across the country that, looked at the longshoremen and say, what is happening here? When they had, and frankly, I had to look it up because I thought it was a, term of art or some piece of technical or a specialized technical aspect. But when they talked about the gate operator, they have to have, somebody operate the gate. I didn't know if that was something to do with the cranes or, so I looked at it, it was like, no, it's actually a gate. And they want to automate the opening and closing of a regular run-of-the-mill gate. I mean, granted, it's probably a lot bigger there, but when you start delving into those issues that, yeah, there is probably a lot of room for improvement and a lot of room for innovation to make America as competitive as, a lot of the other ports around the world.
And so speaking of goods coming in and out of the country, I think it's interesting to think about how we compare internationally. Because when we have economic deals with the countries, trade deals, the question of labor policy often comes up. Famously when NAFTA was negotiated in the early '90s, there was a sort of a lot of debate over the sort of they called the labor side agreement. There was sort of, in addition to sort of the tariffs on which goods and lowering of tariffs, they there was this separate U.S., Canada, Mexico debate over how labor policy would be coordinated. So when it comes to sort of new trade agreements, new economic cooperation agreements, going forward, how should we think about that labor policy internationally? Should we try and, uh, you know, match the other countries that we're trading with? Should we try and pull them in the direction of our policy? Um, what should just directionally, how should we be thinking about that?
Well, some of the things that you saw, especially after the, the UAW contract with the big three, you had executives at Ford going, well, now we may have to look at other countries to do our vehicles uh, because of, some of the provisions are unsustainable. So, I mean, I think, right now, we have to work on innovation in this country and, increasing manufacturing in this country, but taking off some of the roadblocks. And, we're not talking about worker pay or benefits, but some of the provisions in the collective bargaining agreement that, some of the work provisions and some of the things that are against innovation or against, frankly, even giving workers raises and rewarding productivity. Those are the things where I'd really like to see us really innovate and expand out. And, there's been provisions or bills in Congress to allow more of those individualized contracts that I think would really help both workers and manufacturing and American productivity. But rewarding individual workers like, the rest of the, almost 90% of the economy that's non-unionized does already. Things like workers' choice or allowing workers to fully opt out of union representation. Like I said, even with right to work, that simply means a union can't get a worker fired for not paying them, but they're still stuck under the union contract, whether they want to be or not. Workers' choice would allow workers to fully opt out and, not just not have to pay, but also negotiate their own contract. Once again, like almost 90%, or I think it's like 88% of the non-unionized economy does already. It would also free unions from having to represent workers that aren't paying them. So I think that type of individualized worker focus is really where we can, see things thrive, and that would, really help out with the rest of the economy.
All right. Well, that's a pretty good summary. Um, Vinny, this has been a great conversation, and thank you so much for being with us. Before we go, why don't you tell people where everyone can find all of your excellent work online?
Absolutely. It's at the number 4aw.org, I4AW.org. And, we work with great groups from across the country like CEI. I know Sean Higgins is doing good work over there and love working with him. Yeah, I would just invite everybody to go to I4AW.org and you can see the latest happenings in labor policy all across the country.
All right. Thanks again, Vinny.
Thanks for having me on.